The computer screen was the only source of light in the office at 3 in the morning. It cast a cold, bluish glow across Ana Morales' face, drowning everything else in darkness. Outside the window, the city slept quietly, but here, in this minimalist apartment arranged with an almost emotionless precision, Ana's world had narrowed to mere pixels and Dayton on the screen. A low-quality video played, filmed by a local's phone in Xochimilco, the images shaky and blurry. Beneath the murky water of the canal, silver objects moved chaotically. They didn't swim, they twitched. Hundreds of fish collided with one another in a frenzied dance of self-destruction. Their scales were torn, their eyes clouded with panic. They slammed into boat hulls and rotted wooden posts with an unnatural determination. As if their own bodies had become the enemy, Ana paused the video, zooming in on a corner. In a calmer patch of water, a thin sheen coated the surface, shimmering. Under the weak morning sunlight, it wasn't like an oil slick. It gleamed strangely, reflecting light in a sickly rainbow spectrum. From moldy green to the pale pink of raw flesh. Anomalous, she muttered, a habit when working alone. Her fingers glided over the keyboard, opening another window filled with analysis reports. Ammonia levels slightly elevated. Oxygen concentration lowered, but not critical. No traces of heavy metals, no industrial waste that could explain the phenomenon. All official reports reached the same conclusion, inconclusive. They called it Xochimilco syndrome, a scientific name for the death of reason. Ana leaned back in her chair, exhausted, rubbing her temples. This was no longer just work, it had become an obsession. For 3 weeks, she'd spent every free moment digging into this mystery thousands of kilometers away. Her colleagues thought she was overly curious, but they didn't know. They couldn't know that water's color. That murky green, almost black in deeper spots. It tugged at a thread of memory she tried to bury for 20 years. A small, cool hand. Catalina's gripped hers tightly. "Hurry up, Ana. They're selling corn dolls over there." The 7-year-old pointed toward a colorful stall on the shore, her dark eyes sparkling with joy. The Trajinera boat rocked gently as their father pulled it along. It was a sunny day, perfect for a family outing on the canal. One of the rare childhood memories not overshadowed by the darkness of a laboratory. "Slow down, Katie." Ana laughed, holding her sister back. The boat's wobbling, but Catalina was too energetic. She leaned over the boat's edge, trying to get a better look. Then, in a moment where time seemed to freeze, her foot slipped on the wet wooden deck. The splash was deceptively small, absurdly quiet compared to the sudden silence that engulfed the boat. Her father shouted. Her mother screamed. Ana stood frozen, staring at the ripples spreading from where her sister had vanished. She stared into that murky green water, waiting for a hand to break the surface, for a head of black hair to appear. But there was only the water's stillness and her own distorted reflection. Ana exhaled sharply, pulling herself back to the cold reality of her room. The guilt, as always, surged like a frigid tide in her chest. She had done nothing. She had only watched. Now an ecosystem was dying in that same place. And once again, she was just watching from afar, through a screen. No, not this teamy. A decision solidified within her, as firm and clear as a mathematical theorem. Hesitation vanished, replaced by a cold resolve. She wouldn't sit here analyzing others' data anymore. She needed her own samples. She needed to be there. She believed her expertise could see what others had missed. This was no longer about science. It was about redemption. She opened her browser and booked a flight to Mexico City, the earliest one. Then she began compiling a list of equipment: water and sediment sampling kits, a portable microscope, a handheld spectrometer, sterile containers. As she pulled equipment suitcases from the closet, a new email popped up on her screen. Subject: regarding Xochimilco. The sender was Dr. Larkin, her former mentor, a respected ecologist now retired. Ana. The email read, "I heard you're looking into the Xochimilco phenomenon. I just want to offer a word of caution. My father grew up there, and he often spoke of isolated ecosystems in the canals, places with their own rules. He called them pockets of forgotten time. Be careful. There are factors our models can't predict. Don't trust your instruments too much." Ana read the email twice. She respected Larkin, but his words sounded more like superstition than science. Pockets of forgotten time, she scoffed. A poetic way of describing localized pollution. She quickly typed a reply. "Thank you for the advice, Professor. I'll be careful." Then she shut her laptop. 16 hours later, she stepped out of Mexico City's airport. The thick, stifling air immediately enveloped her. After a long taxi ride, she finally reached the Embarcadero Nativitas dock. The chaos of the place was a shock to her senses. Loud mariachi music blared from tourist boats, vendors shouted their wares, and the smells of grilled corn, grease, and wet mud mingled together. It was the opposite of her orderly, quiet life. It was fiercely alive. Ana took a deep breath, steadying herself. Dragging her heavy equipment suitcase behind her, she approached a group of boatmen gathered nearby. She had to start somewhere. She walked up to an older man with a sun-weathered face, offering what she hoped was a friendly smile. "Hello," she said in fluent Spanish. "I need a ride," the man nodded. "Of course, miss. Where to?" Ana swallowed hard, the name feeling like a physical weight on her tongue. "To the island of the dolls." The smile on the older boatman's face froze, then vanished as if it had never existed. He stepped back, his eyes shifting from friendly to wary, then to something deeper. "Fear. No," he said firmly. "I don't go there. I'll pay extra," Ana pleaded, not yet grasping the sudden change. "No price is worth that place." "Miss," the man shook his head, turning away, muttering something in native Spanish that Ana couldn't catch but was certain was a prayer. That refusal was just the beginning. Ana walked along the dock, repeating her request to at least 5 other boatmen. Their reactions varied in form, but not in substance. Some laughed, thinking she was joking. A woman selling goods from a boat looked at her as if she were insane, then hurriedly rowed away. A young man, initially flirting with her, went pale and simply turned his back. They offered no explanations. They just refused. Island of the Dolls seemed a taboo, a name sealed by collective fear. Ana's patience began to wear thin, giving way to frustration. "It's just an island," she told herself. Just a silly name spun from superstitious stories. But the way these grown, hardened people reacted suggested it was no joke as the sun dipped toward the west, painting the clouds orange and purple. Ana was close to giving up. She stood at the edge of the dock, looking beyond the bustling area to where the last Trajinera boats were moored. There, apart from the others, she saw a man. He didn't call out to customers or join in the lively chatter. He worked quietly, wiping down the side of his boat with an old rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He was lean and wiry, his skin darkened by sun and wind. He looked about 45, with deep wrinkles around his eyes. but it was his eyes that caught Ana's attention. They held no fear or curiosity. They were still and hardened, like the surface of a bottomless well with a final spark of hope. Ana approached. "Excuse me," she called. The man looked up, his eyes scanning her briefly, from her expensive hiking boots to her practical jeans to the equipment suitcase behind her. His gaze wasn't probing, just observant. "I need a ride," Ana said, cutting to the point. "To the island of the dolls." He didn't flinch. He just looked at her for a long moment, his silence more unsettling than the outright refusal she'd faced. Finally he spoke, his voice low and even 5,000 pesos. Ana blinked. It was an outrageous price, at least 10 times the usual rate, but she didn't hesitate. It was a test and she knew it. "Fine," she replied instantly. A flicker of surprise passed through the man's hardened eyes. He saw the resolve in her voice, or perhaps the desperation. He stopped wiping the boat and gave a curt nod. "Get on." His name was Mateo. He said nothing more as Ana loaded her gear onto the boat. Named La Esperanza, Hope, an ironically strange name. He pushed off with his pole, and the boat glided away from the dock. For the first 45 minutes, they passed through familiar canals. Music, laughter, and the calls of vendors still echoed. But then Mateo steered into a narrower channel, a path no tourists seemed to take instantly. The world changed, the noise faded, leaving only the rhythmic splash of Mateo's pole in the water. On either side, manicured gardens gave way to wild, overgrown trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The air grew cooler, tinged with the smell of mud and rotting leaves. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was heavy and oppressive. "Why are you going there?" Mateo asked suddenly, breaking the prolonged silence. "Research," Ana answered. "Water research." "Ecosystems," Mateo nodded, as if the answer was unsurprising. "Others come for their own reasons," he said casually. "They think it's just an island. They don't understand that some places have memories." He paused, staring into the water ahead. "They say there are things that shouldn't be disturbed. They sleep under the mud. Leave them alone, and they'll leave you alone." A shiver ran down Ana's spine, but she quickly suppressed it with scientific logic. "That's an interesting legend, but I trust data more," she said, keeping her tone steady. "Maybe there's a methane leak from the canal bed or a local toxic algae. That's what I want to find out." Mateo didn't argue. He just kept rowing in silence, as if he'd said all he needed to. They traveled another 20 minutes in quiet. The sun was nearly at the horizon, casting blood-red streaks across the water. The boat rounded a final bend. "We're here," Mateo announced, his voice still flat and emotionless. "La Cuna Quieta." That's what they called it long ago, before it got its new name. But now, they call it the Island of the Dolls. Ana followed his pointing hand. Before her, in the black water, was a small island. It loomed like a dark silhouette against the vibrant sky. Hanging from branches tucked into dark hollows, and beneath thick foliage were hundreds, maybe thousands of tiny shapes. From this distance, they were just black specks, but Ana knew what they were. Her imagination, which she always tried to suppress, filled in the gaps. She could see them. Faded plastic bodies, tattered dresses, tangled hair, and the eyes. Hundreds of lifeless glass eyes, empty, staring silently at them through the dying light of the sunset asterisk. The boat drifted silently, drawing closer to the shore of the Island of the Dolls. The silence now carried a different tone. It was no longer empty but charged with tense anticipation. As they neared, the small, shadowy figures became clearer, and the horror was no longer confined to Ana's imagination. They were everywhere. Hanging from low branches, heads tilted downward as if freshly strung up, nailed to tree trunks, limbs, splayed in grotesque crucifixion poses, lying face up in piles of rotting leaves, eyes wide open, staring at the gray sky. Some were missing arms or legs, reduced to mere torsos. Others had peeling paint, exposing dark plastic beneath, resembling necrotic flesh. The island's smell hit her, a mix of moldy old plastic, swampy mud, and something cloying, an unsettlingly sweet decay. Part of Ina, the scientist, tried to categorize them. She noted Victorian-style porcelain dolls with tattered dresses, mass-produced. Plastic dolls from the 80s, even cloth figures now limp and coated in slimy moss. But the primal part of her raw instinct, screamed to turn and flee. "Stop here," she said, her voice hoarser than usual. She forced herself to act, pulling rubber gloves from her bag. The snap of the gloves against her skin was jarringly loud in the stillness. The familiar routine of preparing for research steadied her. This was work. Just work, over there. She pointed to a small, nearly isolated pool of water, cut off from the main current. Where the sheen is thickest, Mateo said nothing, silently guiding the boat to the spot Ina indicated. Here, the water was almost stagnant, black and viscous. The iridescent sheen she'd seen in the video was now before her, thick and oily like a spreading stain. No insects hovered over the surface. No signs of life. Ina took out a long sampling tube and a set of sterile glass vials. Kneeling by the boat's edge, she leaned toward the water. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. She didn't dare look up, but she could feel them, hundreds of lifeless eyes boring into her exposed back. The island's silence now felt like a held breath. Her face was inches from the water. She could see her reflection, faint and distorted on the sheen surface. She worked quickly. Water sample, sediment sample, a sample of the oily sheen itself. She moved mechanically, her professionalism the only shield against the rising tide of fear. The clink of the vial's lids echoed unnaturally loud. Finished. She exhaled in relief, carefully placing the sealed sample case in her lap. She looked up, and her gaze locked onto a doll hanging from the nearest branch. It was an old porcelain doll, one eye cracked, forming a scar-like line that seemed to weep. And then it happened. It wasn't a quick or jerky motion. It was slow, almost imperceptible. The porcelain doll's head, previously tilted to one side, gradually straightened, a sluggish, lifeless movement. Like a sunflower lazily seeking the sun, but there was no sun here, and no breeze. Ana's scientific mind screamed rational explanations. Wind? A loose string? An illusion from the boat's motion? She turned to Mateo, ready to voice one of those theories. But she froze. Mateo was staring at the same doll. His face, usually as calm as a still lake, was taut. His lips pressed into a thin line. He had seen it too for an endless moment. They just looked at each other. No words were spoken, but the confirmation was there, clear and terrifying. It wasn't her imagination. Ina's ironclad skepticism began to crack. Mateo acted first. Without a word, he grabbed his long pole and with a forceful, deliberate push, moved the boat away from the shore. There was an urgency in his actions that hadn't been there before. The boat retreated toward the center of the canal, leaving the island behind. Ina sat motionless, clutching the sample case to her chest. It was no longer just a collection of scientific data. The cold glass seeped through her gloves, and she felt a chilling certainty that she had stolen something cursed, something that belonged to the island's silence. And now it was on the boat with her. Mateo rode in silence, a heavy silence Aina could feel on her skin. He didn't look at her, focusing only on putting distance between them and the island fading into the darkness behind. Each stroke of the pole was an effort to widen that gap. The sky had shifted from purple to deep indigo, with the first stars twinkling above after about half an hour. When the island's shadow had vanished around a bend, Mateo steered the boat into a small cove hidden behind a thicket of reeds. "We stay here tonight," he said, his voice still even but laced with an undeniable weariness. The place seemed safe. At least they could no longer see the island as Mateo lit a small fire. On a patch of dry land by the shore, Aina forced herself to return to the purpose of her trip. She couldn't let vague fear override reason. She needed data. She needed answers. She opened her equipment suitcase, the beam of her headlamp casting a cold streak across the stainless steel tools. She set up a folding table, wiped it down with alcohol, and carefully positioned her portable microscope. These familiar methodical actions were like a sedative, creating an illusion of control in a world that had just turned chaotic. She took out one of the sample vials, the one containing the water with the iridescent sheen. Using a dropper, she placed a single drop onto a clean slide. She adjusted the focus, squinting as she peered through the eyepiece. For a second, she thought she'd taken the wrong sample. She expected to see bacteria, single-celled algae, or tiny sediment particles. But what appeared under the lens was something entirely different. It wasn't a collection of individual organisms. It was a network. Thousands, millions of filaments, thinner than hair, woven into a living tapestry. They had the structure of fungal hyphae, but moved with the fluidity of bacteria. They didn't drift passively. The entire network pulsed in unison, rippling like a single organism, as if driven by some form of swarm intelligence. The iridescent sheen she'd seen with the naked eye was light refracting through these countless tiny threads. Impossible. Aina muttered, her breath fogging the eyepiece. She had never seen anything like it. It defied every biological classification she knew. She was adjusting the magnification, trying to see a filament structure more clearly, when a stray hair from her arm fell onto the slide's droplet. The reaction was immediate and horrifying as, if triggered by a silent signal, thousands of nearby filaments stopped their synchronized pulsing. They whipped around and surged toward her hair like sharks scenting blood. They clung to it, wrapping around, encasing it in a vibrating membrane. Even at this magnification, Aina could see the tips of the filaments trying to pierce the hair's tough keratin. They were trying to invade. They were trying to feed down her. Recoiled from the microscope, as if shocked by electricity. She gasped, staring at the tiny lens with pure terror. This wasn't just alive. It was aggressive. It saw organic matter as prey. And it was here, on her boat, in glass vials less than an arm's length away. Aina, Mateo's voice cut through her panicked thoughts from outside. It was tense, a tension she hadn't heard in this man before. She stumbled out of the boat's cabin. Mateo stood at the bow, not looking at her but staring intently toward the island they'd left behind. "Look," he pointed. It was fully dark now, but the moon had risen, bright and clear. From this distance, the island of the dolls was just a black mass against the silver sky. But even so, Aina could see it. The island's outline, shaped by trees and the objects hanging from them, was different. The porcelain doll with the turned head she'd seen once near the water's edge was gone. Other shapes, the tiny black specks hanging in the trees, seemed to have shifted, rearranged into a new pattern she couldn't decipher, but was unmistakably different from Sunset. Her fear doubled. One threat lay under her microscope, another moved silently in the darkness miles away. They were one, and they were alive.
In the shadow of my archive, a new horror stirs. Date to listen.